under the golden light of the ancient palace, a child was born into destiny, not innocence. From her first breath, the priest whispered that she was not a daughter but an offering. The king, her father, saw in her the perfection of his bloodline, a mirror of divine continuity. Every lullaby sung to her carried not love, but prophecy. She was told her purpose was sacred, that the gods themselves demanded she remain pure until chosen. But purity, in this kingdom, did not mean untouched by power, it meant reserved for it. Her toys were not dolls, but miniature crowns, symbols of lineage carved in ivory. At 5, she was dressed in silk, meant for queens, her little hands weighed with gold. The courtiers bowed before her as if she already shared her father's throne and his bed. No one dared question it. The line between worship and corruption had long been erased. In this empire, blood was sacred, and to dilute it was heresy punishable by death. Marriage between kin was not sin, it was sanctification, a ritual of divine preservation. The palace walls murmured with legends of kings who took their daughters to keep heaven's favor intact. What began as religion became routine, and what was forbidden elsewhere became royal duty here. She learned early that affection was a currency, and her father was the empire's richest man. At night, she heard him pray not to gods, but to his ancestors, to justify what he desired. The priests nodded, recording each union as divine will, not mortal indulgence. Her mother had vanished quietly years before, her name erased from every inscription. In her absence, the daughter became both heir and replacement, the vessel of two women's destinies. Every festival celebrated her purity, but beneath the chants lay the tension of an unspoken future. As she grew, the lines between devotion and desire blurred into something neither she nor her tutors could name. Her portraits showed her beside the king, not behind him, an equal in power, yet captive in purpose. When she smiled for the artists, it was not innocence they captured, but resignation. The kingdom praised their beauty, their unity, their divine bond that defied mortal law. But inside the marble corridors, servants wept silently as rituals prepared her for what history would call destiny. She was 14 when the crown maker arrived again, this time to measure her for marriage. The groom was already chosen. He sat beside her every day at supper, calling her my little queen. Her father's gaze lingered too long on the silk against her shoulders, the reflection of his own youth. The drums of celebration masked the horror of what was to come, a union dressed as holiness. And as the kingdom rejoiced, one truth became clear: she was never raised to rule, only to belong. The night before the wedding, she stood before the mirror, trembling, realizing she was marrying her own blood. The incense burned sweetly, but the air was thick with a silence older than guilt itself. What the world would later call incest, her people called eternity, a divine circle that swallowed its own. And when dawn came, the princess walked down the corridor not as a bride, but as an heir sacrificed. The ceremony was silent, the gods unmoved, and the empire watched its purity devour its future. Desire, in her father's court, was never private. It was policy cloaked in divinity. From the moment she became queen, her body ceased to belong to herself. It became a symbol of lineage. Every glance, every gesture, was observed by priests ensuring her devotion served both heaven and the throne. The king called it love, but it was the kind that fed on obedience, not affection. He told her their union pleased the gods, that their blood was the thread holding eternity together. She believed him because disbelief was treason, and treason was death by purification fire. Her chambers became both temple and prison, filled with incense and eyes that never looked away. Desire here was not pleasure, it was discipline, ritualized into sacred duty by generations of royal sin. The high priests wrote hymns comparing her womb to the divine vessel that birthed the first son. At night, she dreamed of rivers, of freedom, of washing away the touch she was told to worship. The palace women pitied her silently, knowing she carried a legacy of lust disguised as holiness. Outside the walls, whispers spread among commoners who saw their king's divinity as nothing more than indulgence. But fear silenced them. For the empire's guards, punished blasphemy with mutilation of tongue and memory. The more the king aged, the more he saw in her his youth, his perfection, his reflection. He demanded she wear his mother's crown, as if replacing the dead could resurrect his power. At feasts, he spoke of purity while his daughter sat beside him, veiled in silk and shame. The courtiers praised their union, though their eyes betrayed unease, a kingdom worshipping decay disguised as tradition. For her, intimacy became performance, choreographed to please both gods and spectators of her captivity. Every touch was witnessed by priests who recorded divine blessings over acts too dark to describe. Her name was added to holy texts, sanctified through her suffering, immortalized as the bride of blood. No man dared speak to her except in ritual. She was both forbidden and defiled, sacred and scarred. The illusion of power was her only armor, for rebellion meant damnation by decree of the gods. Each morning she greeted the sunrise with the same silent question: "Am I a queen or a curse?" She began to understand that control, not desire, ruled the heart of every empire. The king's passion was not love, it was fear of mortality, an attempt to make eternity his captive. He desired dominion over time itself, and she was the vessel through which he tried to deceive death. In the empire's archives, scribes rewrote her story as divine devotion, erasing every trace of her resistance. To the world, she was a goddess reborn. To herself, she was a child consumed by faith and power. And as her father's shadow grew longer, she realized his desire was not for her, but for what she represented. He loved in her the illusion of immortality, the reflection that would die preserving his myth. She was the living lie of a dying god, worshipped by all, loved by none. The scandal began quietly, like a rumor born in candlelight, whispered through corridors heavy with perfume and fear. The princess had grown into a woman, and the people began to see what the priests tried to hide. Her resemblance to the king was uncanny. His eyes, his voice, even the curve of her face mirrored his. At ceremonies, she stood beside him not as a consort, but as an echo, an unsettling reflection of his sin. Foreign envoys watched in silence, their letters home dripping with veiled disgust and fascination. They wrote of a kingdom where gods blessed incest and where desire sat upon the throne. One envoy from the neighboring empire refused to bow, calling the union an abomination dressed in gold. For that, his tongue was cut, his body hung on the palace gates as a warning to others. The king, enraged by dissent, declared that blood must remain pure, or the empire's favor would die. He introduced a new ritual. Each royal bride must be blessed by the same divine union before her wedding. Behind the veils of piety, fathers and daughters were offered to the altar of lineage and eternity. The palace turned into a sanctuary of silence, where even screams were forbidden to echo. But truth, like smoke, cannot be contained. It seeped through cracks in the marble halls. Servants began vanishing, scribes were executed, and the high priest, who doubted the ritual, was burned alive. The princess watched helplessly as devotion became tyranny, her father's faith rotting into obsession, her eyes hollowed with guilt, knowing every act of worship was written in someone else's blood. She begged the priest to end the cycle, to let her live as a daughter, not a deity, but they bowed, chained by centuries of doctrine, claiming her suffering was proof of divine approval. The scandal reached its climax during the Festival of Renewal, where she was to bear the king's heir. The court gathered to witness the union, masked as a sacred performance before the gods. She stood before the altar, trembling, dressed in white silk that shimmered like false purity. The king raised his hands to bless her, his voice echoing across the temple like a curse. But before the ritual could begin, the sky cracked with thunder, a storm no one had foreseen. The wind tore through the sacred banners, extinguishing torches, scattering ashes across the marble floor. The priests fell to their knees, whispering that the gods had spoken through the chaos. The princess, eyes filled with terror, saw her father collapse mid-prayer, struck by unseen wrath. His crown rolled from his head, clattering to her feet like the sound of judgment itself. The temple erupted in screams as the high priest declared the curse fulfilled. The gods had rejected their bloodline. The people outside the palace rejoiced in fear and relief, believing divine punishment had restored balance. The princess, trembling beside her father's corpse, realized she had inherited both his throne and his sin, and in that moment, she understood that the true scandal was not their love, but the silence that allowed it. For every kingdom that worships power above humanity eventually finds its altar drenched in its own blood. With the king dead, the court did not weep. They waited, like vultures circling the scent of power. The priests moved swiftly, declaring that his death was not punishment, but transcendence, a sacrifice to preserve divine order. The princess was crowned beside his still warm body, her tears mistaken for ritual anointment. But her coronation was no liberation. It was a continuation of the same golden prison. The council whispered that she must marry again to maintain cosmic balance, to fulfill the law of blood. In truth, they feared a woman ruling alone, one who carried the shame of forbidden lineage. They sought to bind her through alliance, offering noblemen and distant cousins like sacrifices disguised as suitors. But she refused them all, each proposal a reminder that her worth was measured by the men around her. Her defiance unsettled the priests, who had built their power on her submission and sanctity. They spread rumors that she had inherited her father's madness, that the gods whispered in her ear. Soon she was isolated, watched, censored, and slowly erased from her own decrees. The throne she sat upon became colder each day, its gold more coffin than crown. In her chambers, courtiers plotted, trading loyalty for survival, spinning webs of seduction and deceit. The empire was now ruled not by one ruler's lust, but by a dozen secret ambitions. The high priest, fearing her independence, placed a spiritual advisor at her side, a man chosen to tame her will. He was young, intelligent, and dangerously charming, cloaked in holiness but driven by personal hunger. His sermons dripped with insinuation. He spoke of cleansing her lineage through holy union once again. The court gasped. The scandal revived, history threatening to repeat itself under a new disguise. He claimed the gods demanded another sacred marriage to atone for her father's sins. But this time, the princess was no longer the silent vessel. She had learned what power truly meant. Behind the marble pillars, she began weaving alliances with generals and servants tired of divine deceit. She promised them a kingdom ruled by law, not lust, a dangerous promise in a land built on both. Her rebellion was not shouted in public squares. It was whispered behind locked doors, written in coded scrolls. Every smile she gave in court was a mask, every gesture a move in her quiet war. The priest who sought to control her soon found his influence fading, his sermons ignored. One night, he vanished, his robes discovered near the temple fountain, stained with crimson and silence. The next morning, the princess entered court dressed in mourning white, eyes calm as marble. She announced a new decree. All records of divine marriage were to be burned, erased from history. The priests screamed blasphemy, but the soldiers obeyed their queen, for her father's shadow no longer ruled them. Every scroll that once sanctified incest turned to ash, every tablet that justified sin shattered beneath her will. For the first time in generations, the palace smelled not of incense, but of smoke and freedom. Yet beneath the victory, a quiet dread lingered. She knew the gods of men do not die easily. Power built on corruption does not forgive its destroyer. It waits, silent until history hungers again. Outside the palace walls, the world began to shift, but not as swiftly as she hoped. The commoners whispered her name with both reverence and fear, unsure if she was savior or heretic. For generations they had worshipped the lie, and now truth felt like blasphemy spoken too loud. Markets buzzed with gossip. Some claimed she was cursed, others swore she walked with the favor of real gods. In the countryside, peasants burned old idols, while priests secretly rebuilt them under the moon's protection. Change, like faith, was never pure. It came clothed in contradiction and blood. The princess turned queen toured her kingdom, veiled and unguarded, to see what her father's divinity had wrought. She found temples filled with starving children, and widows offered as tribute to invisible deities. Farmers knelt before her, asking if the gods were dead or merely sleeping after their feast of kings. Her answer was measured. No god who demands your daughters deserves your worship. Those words spread like wildfire, igniting hearts and provoking fury among the clergy. In cities, women painted her likeness on walls, calling her the queen who broke the circle. But for every voice that praised her, another cursed her as the bringer of plague and drought. When the rains failed one season, the priests declared divine punishment for her rebellion. They urged the people to repent, to restore the sacred unions that once pleased the heavens. Crowds began to turn, frightened by hunger more than faith, desperate for someone to blame. Her courtiers begged her to compromise, to perform a symbolic ritual of purity to calm the unrest. She refused, knowing a single concession would resurrect every chain she had broken. Instead, she opened the temple gates and showed the people the bones of sacrificed children buried beneath. The sight shattered centuries of belief. The sacred halls now reeked of truth and decay. Women wept, men cursed, and the silence that followed was heavier than prayer. That night, riots erupted, not against her, but against the priests who had guarded those graves. The temples burned, their golden idols melting into pools of molten shame. She stood on the palace balcony, watching fire consume the same faith that once consumed her. For a moment, she felt free, until she noticed her soldiers hesitating, their loyalty split between crown and creed. Many had been raised on the same lies she sought to erase, and belief dies slower than flesh. Her reforms were bold. Marriage by choice, education for girls, punishment for coercion disguised as religion. Yet each decree carved deeper divisions between those who wanted change and those who worshipped the past. In the markets, merchants sold charms claiming to protect families from the queen's curse. Even her own advisors whispered that too much freedom would unmake the empire's soul. The palace, once filled with hymns, now echoed with debates, betrayal, and the sound of a civilization unraveling. Still, she did not falter. She knew truth demanded more than faith. It demanded fire. She ordered the great bell of the capital rung, declaring the end of divine marriages forever. Its sound rolled through valleys and deserts, a funeral toll for false gods and broken daughters. And though the empire trembled, something within its people began to awaken, the will to question and to remember. But every revolution births its reckoning, and hers came wrapped in devotion and deceit. As the fires of rebellion cooled, whispers returned, whispers of omens, droughts, and angry gods demanding balance. The same priests she had spared began to preach again, this time in shadows, calling her a desecrator. They claimed her defiance had disturbed the ancestors, that the bloodline was cursed until she atoned. One night, a dead bird was found on her throne, its wings nailed open, its eyes replaced with pearls. It was an ancient omen, used only when the priesthood declared divine war against a ruler. The queen understood the message. The gods of her father had not vanished, only hidden their vengeance. Her advisors urged her to crush the cult, to burn every priest and silence the old faith forever. But she hesitated. Too much blood had already been spilled in the name of righteousness. Mercy, however, is a language tyranny understands only as weakness. Within weeks, temples once destroyed were rebuilt in secret, their fires glowing through the night. Her spies reported that even some of her generals attended these rituals, swearing loyalty to the eternal blood. She realized her victory had been only half won. Belief was immortal, more dangerous than swords. Then came the betrayal that would define her. Rain, her most trusted commander, the one who had helped her burn the archives, knelt before her one morning. He confessed that he had been chosen as the new divine husband by the priesthood. The same ritual she had outlawed was now being resurrected in her name, twisting reform into heresy. They claimed the gods demanded her union with this new vessel to restore harmony to the heavens. If she refused, the priests warned famine would devour the land and the people would rise against her. For days she locked herself away, pacing before her mirror, haunted by her father's reflection staring back. The past she had buried clawed its way through time, dragging her toward the same altar she destroyed. On the seventh night, she emerged in full regalia, dressed not in white but in black silk. The priests awaited her in the temple, chanting prayers that once sanctified her father's crimes. They bowed, expecting her surrender, but her silence was sharper than any blade. She approached the altar slowly, each step echoing like thunder through the hollow sanctuary. Then she spoke, her voice steady. "If the gods demand blood, let it be theirs, not mine." The torches flared as hidden soldiers stormed the temple, sealing its doors from within. Screams filled the chamber as fire consumed idols, scrolls, and priests alike. Outside, the people watched the temple burn, unsure if they were witnessing liberation or damnation. When dawn came, the queen stood before them, ash covering her face like war paint. She declared the old gods dead, their temples forbidden, their rituals crimes against the living. The rebellion that followed was swift, savage and unstoppable, brother against brother, faith against truth. The empire split between those who worshipped her and those who feared her. And as the first rays of sunlight touched the ruins, she knew she had won the war but lost the soul of her kingdom. In destroying the gods, she had inherited their loneliness. The years that followed turned her victory into legend and her legend into warning. The temple ruins became a forbidden monument, their charred stones whispering the price of rebellion. No one dared rebuild them, yet pilgrims still came at night, leaving offerings for a queen they both feared and adored. Her portraits changed over time. Once depicted as divine, she was now painted with sorrow and steel in her eyes. Children were told her story as both caution and prophecy, the woman who defied the gods and lived, but living became her punishment. For the ghosts of her choices haunted every corner of the palace. Each morning she walked past the throne, touching it like a wound she could never close. Advisors urged her to remarry, to secure the bloodline and restore faith in the crown. She refused, declaring that no child of hers would ever be born under divine chains. That vow sealed her dynasty's fate. The royal line would die with her, ending centuries of sacred blood. Historians would later call it the cleansing of the crown, a moral victory wrapped in tragedy. But within her lifetime, it brought isolation, no allies, no heirs, only the echo of power fading slowly. She devoted her final years to rewriting the empire's laws, turning faith into philosophy and worship into wisdom. Scholars replaced priests, libraries replaced altars. Her palace became a sanctuary for thinkers once silenced. Yet even among her new disciples, she saw the old hunger, the same desire for control hiding behind enlightenment. One advisor proposed deifying her after death, claiming she was too sacred to vanish into mortality. She smiled bitterly, knowing the circle had already begun to form again. "I broke their gods," she said, "only for men to build me into one." When she grew frail, she ordered her burial to be nameless. No temple, no statue, no legacy carved in stone. Her final decree forbade any future ruler from claiming divine lineage, under penalty of death. But the irony of power is that it always survives its own destruction. A century later, a new dynasty rose, calling themselves the Children of the Broken Queen. They built shrines in her name, prayed to her as a goddess of defiance and purity. Her image returned to the temples she burned, reborn, sanctified, and stripped of the truth she died for. Archaeologists centuries later would find inscriptions twisting her story into myth, erasing her human struggle. They recorded her as a saint, not a woman, a savior, not a victim of inherited sin. Her father's sins faded into obscurity, while her own courage became an ornament for those who never knew her pain. The forbidden practices she ended would never return, but the mindset behind them, the hunger for control, endured. Empires fall, gods die, and rituals vanish, yet the human need to sanctify power remains eternal, and so her story lingered, buried beneath praise and distortion, waiting for those brave enough to uncover the truth. In time, her name became less a memory and more a mirror, reflecting every civilization that mistakes dominion for divinity. Centuries later, her story survives only in fragments, half-truths carved on cracked tablets, myths sung by voices afraid of silence. Historians debate whether she was a savior or a heretic, a visionary or a monster molded by circumstance. Each empire that rises finds a piece of itself in her, its pride, its corruption, its desperate hunger to be immortal. To some, she is the woman who killed the gods. To others, the queen who tried to replace them. But the truth lies between devotion and defiance. She was neither saint nor sinner, only human beneath the crown. Modern scholars translate her decrees and marvel at how her rebellion still echoes in the laws of nations. Her words on freedom and choice are now quoted in universities, stripped of the blood that birthed them. They forget that every syllable she spoke was forged in trauma, loss, and defiance against her own blood. Psychologists read her life as a case of generational control, how power and abuse disguise themselves as destiny. Yet none can capture the smell of burning incense, the sound of temple bells, or the look in her eyes that night. She wasn't fighting gods. She was fighting the disease of inheritance, the belief that obedience is virtue. And though she burned the temples, the idea behind them still breathes, in palaces, in politics, in modern faith. Today, her legacy stands as both prophecy and warning, that holiness without conscience becomes tyranny with a crown. Each era finds new ways to repeat her tragedy. Different gods, different altars, the same hunger for control. In boardrooms, parliaments, and pulpits, her father's spirit lives on, smiling behind new faces and justifications. Civilizations advance, but the instinct to dominate through devotion evolves more gracefully than morality itself. We call it progress, but it is only ritual reborn, power sanctified, submission renamed as order. And so, her tale endures not as history, but as reflection, a mirror for every generation that thinks itself pure. When you look into it, you must ask, which are we, the daughter who defied, or the father who disguised desire as faith? For in that answer lies the fate of every empire still pretending its sins are sacred. Her story ends where ours begins, with a question that refuses to die. How many of our gods were merely men?